My name is Vanessa. I'm 28 years old, and for as long as I can remember, classic cars have been the heartbeat of my life. I wasn't raised to love them. In fact, my family never really understood why I did. But from the moment I saw my grandfather's 1969 Corvette Stingray as a little girl, something inside me lit up and never went out. Before I tell you what happened the day I came home and found my car, my dream, gone without a trace, I want to ask you something. Have you ever had someone in your family take something from you and act like it was theirs to give away? Leave me a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I read every single one. And if this story hits close to home, if you've ever had to fight to be respected or protect what's yours, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. I truly hope your day is filled with peace, with clarity, and with blessings, because some days we need to choose ourselves just to make it through. Now let me tell you how everything unraveled. 3 weeks ago, I was on a work trip in Tokyo. It was the biggest professional moment of my career. I had left my Corvette, a perfectly restored 1969 Stingray I'd spent 5 years working 70-hour weeks to afford, in what I thought was the safest place possible, my parents' garage. I even gave them instructions. Don't drive it, don't move it, just cover it and start the engine once a week. That car wasn't just a car, it was my heart, my freedom. A symbol of everything I had built with my own hands while they were busy doting on my younger sister. I had trusted them. But when I returned home after 3 weeks away, the garage was empty. At first, I was confused, then panicked. I ran through every scenario: theft, a misunderstanding, maybe even a tow. But when I asked my mother where the car was, she didn't flinch. She smiled, and then she said something I'll never forget. "Thanks to your car, our daughter is having the time of her life." It took me a moment to understand what she meant. She wasn't talking about me. She was talking about my sister, and then I saw it on social media. Photos of her on a Mediterranean cruise, sipping champagne, lounging in a private balcony suite, tagging locations I'd only ever dreamed of visiting. That's when it clicked. They sold my car, the car I had worked half a decade to afford, the one connection I had to my grandfather, the one thing in my life that made me feel like I had truly accomplished something on my own. They sold it to send my sister on vacation. No discussion, no permission, no apology, just the assumption that I'd be fine with it, that I'd understand, that I'd get over it, because that's what I always did. I was the strong one, the independent one, the one who didn't need attention, help, or fairness. But this time, they went too far, because when I stood there, stunned and silent, watching the people I loved justify what they'd done, something in me changed. I stopped being the one who let things slide. I stopped letting their excuses count as explanations. And I decided something, not in anger, not even in grief, but in total piercing clarity. They were going to learn what it meant to cross someone who had finally learned her worth. Long before I ever earned enough to buy the car, I knew exactly what it would look like. Rally red, chrome trim, black leather interior. It wasn't just a vision. It was a promise I made to myself when I was 7 years old, standing in my grandfather's garage with grease on my cheeks and wide eyes full of awe. Most kids watched cartoons on Saturday mornings. I listened to engines purr and metal tools clink against concrete. My grandfather restored vintage cars in his spare time, and he let me be his little apprentice. He never minded the questions or the oil stains I left behind. He said I had a good ear, that I could tell when a car was talking. That meant something to me. He never told anyone else that. Not my mom, not my dad, and certainly not my sister. With him, I felt like someone worth teaching, someone who belonged. But once I left his garage and stepped back into the house, that feeling evaporated. My parents never really knew what to do with me. I was quiet, practical, more interested in torque ratios than ballet recitals. My mother would sigh whenever I came home with dirt under my fingernails. She once said I'd never find a husband if I kept smelling like gasoline. I remember staring at her, unsure why that was supposed to matter. I wasn't looking for anyone. I was looking for something to believe in. My father was a little better. He wasn't as harsh, but he didn't get it either. He'd watch me rebuild a carburetor with that furrowed brow he always had when something confused him, and then change the subject. He liked order, predictability, daughters who fit into neat, clean boxes. And that was never me. But Heather? She was everything they understood. 4 years younger than me and somehow always 10 steps ahead in their eyes. She liked pretty dresses and school dances. She cried easily, laughed loudly, and got excited about things like prom themes and celebrity gossip. The kind of daughter my parents knew how to raise. When Heather wanted something, she didn't ask. She pouted. And like clockwork, they gave in. Dance classes, expensive haircuts, the newest phone, a car for graduation. Meanwhile, I got birthday cards with $20 bills and long talks about the importance of student loans. They didn't mean to play favorites, or maybe they did, and just called it something else. They said I was strong, independent, not like Heather, who needed more. And at some point, I stopped fighting it. I stopped asking for things they didn't want to give. I learned how to get them on my own. That's what college was for me, an escape. I left home determined to make something of myself, and I did. I got a finance degree, worked 3 jobs, graduated with honors, and every cent I didn't spend went straight into the account I called Stingray. Other people bought designer bags or traveled through Europe. I lived with roommates in a shoebox apartment and packed the same lunch every day for 5 years. I didn't go on vacations. I didn't upgrade my phone. I didn't waste anything. Because I was chasing something that mattered, something that wasn't about anyone else. And when I finally bought that car, that exact model, that exact year, in that exact shade of red, it wasn't just a goal checked off a list. It was a declaration that I had made it, that I had taken all their doubts, all their shrugs and sidesteps and dismissals, and turned them into fuel. They didn't congratulate me. Not really. My dad said, "Nice car." My mom warned me not to drive it too fast. Heather posted a selfie with it and wrote, "Look what my sister bought, LOL." That was it. They didn't see the weight of it. They didn't see what it meant to me. Because they'd never seen me fully. Not when I was a kid, not when I left home, and not when I came back successful. So when they sold that car, when they handed it off like it was just an object, just metal and rubber, it wasn't just a betrayal. It was confirmation. They had never seen me, and they never thought they had to. But they were about to learn something, because I wasn't 7 anymore. And this time, I wasn't going to just disappear into the background and let it slide. The day after I got home, the numbness started to wear off. At first, it had felt like I was floating above my own life, like someone had cracked open the shell of my reality and poured in static. But by morning, I was grounded again, and what I felt wasn't confusion or grief anymore. It was fire. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I opened my laptop and started digging. There was a moment where I thought maybe, just maybe, they hadn't actually sold it. Maybe they had moved it. Maybe they had loaned it to someone temporarily. The kind of hopeful denial that only exists for a few hours after betrayal, before the truth sinks its teeth in and doesn't let go. But the truth came fast. The buyer had wired money into their account a week earlier. I found the transaction in my mother's email, left open on the family desktop like it was a recipe or a coupon code. There was no shame in it, no secrecy, just a receipt with a number that made my stomach turn. $50,000, $50,000 for a 1969 Corvette Stingray in mint condition, custom restored, matching my grandfather's original car in almost every detail, a vehicle that easily fetched $85,000 at auction, and they sold it for just over half of what it was worth. Not only had they betrayed me, they'd done it stupidly, carelessly, like it wasn't worth the effort to even research the car they were giving away. That's when I realized they didn't just devalue the car, they devalued me. Because if you love someone, truly love them, you don't sell their most prized possession behind their back for half its value. You don't make life-altering decisions on their behalf. You don't pretend to know what something is worth when you never took the time to understand why it mattered in the first place. They hadn't just underestimated my car, they had underestimated me, but they were about to learn just how much I had grown in the years since I'd left this house. I wasn't the quiet kid with oil-stained fingers anymore. I was a woman who negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts for a living. A woman who knew how to dig through paperwork, cross-check VINs, read financial statements, and leverage what I found. And what I found was worse than I thought. They had forged my signature on the bill of sale, on the release of liability, on the transfer form. It was my name, in handwriting that barely mimicked mine, scribbled like an afterthought. That was when the betrayal turned from emotional to criminal. This wasn't just a family dispute anymore. This was theft, fraud, wire fraud, maybe even identity theft. And still, they smiled at me in the kitchen like nothing had happened. They talked about Heather's cruise like it was a humanitarian mission, like giving her a luxury vacation was somehow more important than everything I had built from scratch. They acted like I was being dramatic, like I should be happy for her, like I had no right to be upset because, of course, I'd be fine. I always was. But that day, as I sat in the silence of my old childhood bedroom, staring at documents that looked like a punch in the gut, I made a decision. I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't even going to explain why what they did was wrong. They wouldn't hear me if I tried. They never had. What I was going to do was respond in the only language they seemed to understand: consequences. They thought they sold a car, but what they really sold was the last bit of benefit of the doubt I'd ever give them. And they did it cheap. The following Sunday, my parents hosted a lunch for the extended family. It was supposed to be a casual celebration for Heather, a little gathering to welcome her home after what they all called the most transformative trip of her life. I wasn't invited, not officially, but I showed up anyway. I needed to see it. I needed to feel the atmosphere for myself, to look each of them in the eye and see who had known, who had helped, and who had stayed silent. The house was decorated with pastel streamers and gold-rimmed plates. There were candles on the table, champagne chilling in a silver bucket, and a slideshow of photos from the cruise playing on the living room TV. Heather was glowing, tanned, rested, full of stories she couldn't wait to tell. She walked through the house like royalty, basking in the attention. Everyone laughed, everyone praised her. They toasted her growth, her courage, her future. And not one person asked about my car. I sat near the window, sipping water I couldn't swallow, and let the laughter wash over me like waves I couldn't quite stand up in. There was a moment when my aunt mentioned how generous it was for my parents to help Heather take that trip. My mother smiled like a queen. My father said something about doing what's right for your children. Everyone nodded. Someone clapped. I watched them all. People I had grown up with. People who had watched me scrape my way to where I was, and realized that no one saw me. Not really. I had been erased, quietly and efficiently, replaced by someone more convenient, someone easier to applaud. In their version of this story, I was irrelevant, maybe even selfish, maybe even the problem. And so I sat still, hands folded in my lap as they raised their glasses to celebrate a theft. I could have stood up. I could have shouted that they'd funded that cruise by selling a car they didn't own, that they'd lied, committed fraud, forged my name. I could have told them exactly how much they'd stolen. Not just in money, but in memory, in dignity, in trust. But I didn't. Because I knew now that words wouldn't matter. Not to them. They'd made their choices. And I was about to make mine. That night, when the guests were gone and the laughter had faded into leftover dishes and half-burned candles, I sat in my car outside the house and opened a notebook I hadn't touched in years. It was where I used to plan budgets, goals, timelines. I opened to a fresh page and wrote a single word at the top: reclamation. This wouldn't be revenge. I wasn't interested in revenge. This was about recovery, about truth, about showing them, not telling them, that the girl they had dismissed had grown teeth. I started listing everything: the date of the transaction, the buyer's name from the email, the fake signature, the VIN discrepancy, the market value of the vehicle. I researched Illinois auto laws, federal wire fraud statutes, and civil litigation paths. I made calls, quiet ones, strategic ones, because if they thought they'd get away with it, if they believed for 1 second that this was going to blow over, they didn't know me at all. They thought I would absorb the damage. But I was done absorbing. They thought I would move on. But I was just getting started. After that family lunch, something in me shifted. I no longer felt shocked. I didn't feel hurt in the same way either. I was clear, coldly clear. I knew what had happened. I understood who I was dealing with, and I saw the line they had crossed for what it truly was: a violation they didn't think would ever come back to haunt them. But I wasn't going to haunt them. I was going to hold them accountable, quietly, strategically. The first thing I did was request access to my vehicle's title from the state. The car had always been in my name, purchased, insured, and registered under me. I had the paperwork stored safely, and I knew every digit of the VIN by heart. So when I got the notification that a transfer request had been submitted with my signature attached, my stomach twisted. There it was, in grainy scan. My name, misspelled. The pen strokes uneven. It was laughable. They hadn't even tried to get it right. I printed everything. I made duplicates, triplicates. I organized them into folders labeled with dates and keywords. I wasn't rushing. I didn't need to. My anger wasn't loud anymore. It was focused. Next, I contacted a friend from college who worked in legal compliance. I didn't give names. I kept it vague. Hypothetically, I said, if someone sold a car they didn't own and forged the owner's name on the transfer paperwork, what would the legal implications be? He didn't even hesitate. That's grand theft auto. If the vehicle was sold for over $10,000, it's a felony in most states. Add forgery and wire fraud and it stacks. Easy 10 to 15 years if the DA goes after it. I thanked him, hung up, sat in silence. 10 to 15 years. That wasn't just accountability. That was prison. And as much as they deserved consequences, I wasn't sure I could live with seeing my parents behind bars. But I didn't have to decide that yet. I had time. And options. While gathering documents, I also began tracing the money. The sale had been processed through a wire transfer from someone named Peter Donovan, sent directly to a joint account my parents had used for years. A collector, most likely. The email from him was brief, polite. Thank you for the smooth transaction. Looking forward to finalizing the title. He had no idea he'd bought a car from people who didn't own it, and that made him a victim too. So now there were two of us. Two people who had been deceived. One lied to, one robbed. I tracked down his business through public listings. He ran a small restoration garage in Indiana. I found pictures of his showroom, complete with a recent upload of his newest edition. A red 1969 Stingray, the same color, the same trim, the same engine block number. My car. And he had no clue. I wasn't ready to contact him yet. Not until I had everything I needed. But I stared at that photo of my Corvette sitting under someone else's fluorescent lights, and felt something cold settle in my chest. They hadn't just taken the car, they'd given it away, and someone else was polishing it now, admiring it, starting the engine and listening to a sound that had once belonged to me. I didn't cry. I just got back to work. Over the next several days, I consulted an attorney, a woman named Alicia I had met years ago at a networking event. Smart, precise, no nonsense. I didn't tell her the full story right away. I let her ask the questions. As I laid out the documents, the forged signatures, the bank transfers, the emails, she grew quieter. Her expression didn't change much, but I noticed the way she kept adjusting her pen between her fingers, like she was holding back judgment. When I finished, she leaned forward and asked just one thing. "Do you want to go public or keep this private?" I didn't answer right away, because that wasn't a question I could take lightly. Going public would mean court, lawyers, press a lawsuit that could make everything official and permanent. But it would also mean exposure, my family's name in legal filings, a permanent rift. Keeping it private would mean negotiating behind closed doors, forcing restitution, making them face what they'd done without dragging it through headlines. But it would also mean they'd get to contain the fallout, keep their dignity intact, walk away with their lives unchanged, while mine had been torn open. In the end, I asked for both options, because I hadn't yet decided what I wanted more, justice or peace. But I did know this. I wasn't going to let it go, and I wasn't going to warn them. They wouldn't see me coming. The night of the family dinner felt colder than it should have, even though the air was warm. I arrived early, not out of eagerness, but because I wanted to see it for myself, to absorb every detail before the room filled with noise. I parked a block away and walked slowly, my heart heavy but steady. The lights inside the house glowed golden through the windows, like nothing had ever gone wrong here. Like love still lived inside those walls. But I knew better. Inside, the table was set with care. The good dishes, the ones only brought out for birthdays or holidays, had returned. There were name cards folded neatly beside wine glasses. At the center sat a floral arrangement so large and dramatic it felt like it was trying to convince someone that everything was beautiful, that nothing had been stolen. I took a seat near the edge of the table, away from the center of the celebration. No one seemed to notice I was early. No one asked why I looked tired. They just handed me a glass and told me to enjoy the evening. Heather arrived 10 minutes later, glowing as always. Her hair was freshly cut, her skin still sun-kissed from the cruise. She wore a dress that probably cost more than one of my rent checks, and her voice carried through the room like she was the guest of honor at her own coronation. Everyone turned to listen to her stories, to laugh at her jokes, to toast her adventures. She had returned from her transformative journey full of inspiration and gratitude. Or so she said. No one asked how she paid for it. No one asked what it cost. Because in this family, hard questions don't get asked when the answers might be uncomfortable. The illusion of harmony always took precedence over the truth, even if that harmony came at someone's expense. That night, I didn't speak much. I listened. I watched. I took inventory of every face, every smile, every toast lifted in my sister's direction. I memorized the tone of my mother's laugh, the way my father placed his hand on Heather's shoulder with pride. It wasn't jealousy. I wasn't envious of their love for her. I was simply no longer blind to the price they were willing to pay to keep her comfortable. And this time, the price had been me. Somewhere between the third course and the dessert, my mother stood to give a speech. She called Heather her brave girl, said the cruise had helped her find herself again, said it had been a sacrifice worth making. Everyone nodded, even clapped. I stared at my plate. I wondered what they'd say if I stood and asked what it felt like to steal from someone they claimed to love. What it felt like to watch one daughter wither so the other could shine. But I didn't speak. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't challenge the story they had built around this night. Because that's exactly what it was. A story. A carefully constructed fantasy where I was the shadow and Heather was the light. Where my silence was mistaken for consent. Where my absence from their narrative meant I didn't matter. But I had learned something powerful in the weeks since discovering the truth. Silence can be a weapon, and tonight I was sharpening mine. As the night dragged on, I noticed something new. The way my father avoided eye contact. The way my mother checked her phone, distracted. The way Heather looked at me sometimes. Not with guilt, but with something close to discomfort. Like she knew, deep down, that I had become a variable she could no longer predict. They knew I knew. And they were waiting. Waiting to see if I'd make a scene. Waiting to see if I'd embarrass them. Waiting to see if I'd stay quiet, like I always had. And I did. But not because I was afraid, because I wanted them to sit in their uncertainty. I wanted them to feel the weight of not knowing what I would do next. After dessert, people started leaving. Hugs were exchanged, compliments were given. Heather stood at the door like a politician, thanking each guest as if she'd hosted the entire thing herself. I slipped out without a word, unnoticed again, but this time, by choice. As I walked back to my car, I felt no sadness, no longing, no regret, only clarity. They had chosen to celebrate her by destroying something sacred to me. They had written me out of their script so they could keep their favorite character in the spotlight. And for the first time, I wasn't interested in earning a role back. I was writing a new script now, and they weren't going to like how it ended. The envelope was heavier than it should have been. Just a few sheets of paper inside, but it felt like it carried the weight of everything I hadn't said, everything I had swallowed, everything they assumed I would never act on. I stood in line at the post office holding it in my hand, my fingers curled so tightly around the edges that they left creases in the corners. I didn't smile. I didn't flinch. I stepped forward, handed it over the counter, and watched as the clerk stamped it. Certified. Return receipt requested. That was it. No speech, no confrontation, just a quiet, deliberate action. The letter was addressed to my parents. Inside was a formal notification prepared by my attorney, a demand for full restitution for the unauthorized sale of a vehicle registered in my name. The tone was neutral, cold, not angry, just factual. A calm storm, one that couldn't be ignored. It outlined the entire sequence. The forged signature, the unlawful sale, the misrepresentation of ownership, the financial value lost, the potential charges that could be pursued if resolution was not reached. It ended with a firm deadline. 10 days to respond in writing with a proposal for repayment. No contact by phone, no apologies, no explanations, just action. When I walked out of the post office, the sun felt different on my skin, like something had shifted in the atmosphere, like I was no longer playing by their rules. The silence didn't last long. The first voicemail came 2 days later. My dad. His voice was tight, careful, the same tone he used when trying to diffuse tension without addressing the cause. He asked if we could talk things through like a family. I didn't respond. The next day, my mother called. Twice. Then a text. Vanessa, please don't do this. You don't understand what this could do to us. But that was the problem. They thought I didn't understand. They thought I was acting out of spite or emotion, that I was just hurt or angry or having some dramatic reaction. But they didn't understand that this wasn't a reaction. It was a response. A precise, measured response to something they had done freely, knowingly, without remorse. What they couldn't admit, even now, was that they had crossed a line they never expected me to defend. And I had. The 7th day after the letter was delivered, I received an email from my father. No greeting, no warmth, just a single PDF file attached with the subject line, "Our response." It was a typed statement, barely a paragraph long. They acknowledged the sale, claimed they believed I would have approved if I understood the context, and offered to pay me back as soon as they were able. No amount, no plan, no apology. I forwarded the email to my lawyer and stared at the screen for a long time. There it was, proof that they still didn't get it. They thought this was about money. It wasn't. It was about being robbed of something I had bled for. It was about being silenced my whole life and finally speaking in a language they couldn't ignore. It was about being told I didn't matter, again, and finally standing in the truth that I did. I drafted a reply under my lawyer's guidance, short, firm. I repeated the deadline. I restated the amount, $85,000, not $50, not what they sold it for, the full value, because they hadn't just taken a car, they had taken trust, time, history. The countdown resumed. I thought I would feel more anxious, that something in me would unravel from the tension. But the opposite happened. I felt steady. For the first time in years, maybe ever, I wasn't waiting for their approval. I wasn't hoping they'd finally see me. I wasn't longing for understanding. I was simply doing what needed to be done. They had made a choice, and now they would face what came with it. 10 days passed. No check arrived. No plan was submitted. Instead, my mother showed up at my apartment building. I saw her from the window first. She stood on the sidewalk, phone in hand, pacing. I didn't go down. I didn't open the door. I watched her turn, leave, and disappear down the street. The next morning, another voicemail. She sounded different this time. Small, scared. "We can't afford to fix this, Vanessa. Please don't destroy our lives over a misunderstanding." But it wasn't a misunderstanding. It was theft. It was betrayal. It was years of being second to someone who never had to earn anything, culminating in a final insult disguised as sacrifice. I called my attorney. We were moving forward. They would be served next. The day I mailed the letter, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated or powerful. I just felt ready. It was a quiet kind of readiness, the kind that comes when you've been sitting with a truth for so long it no longer burns. It simply hardens. My chest didn't ache anymore. My hands didn't tremble. There were no tears behind my eyes, only stillness. I had spoken with a lawyer, gathered every document, every digital breadcrumb they'd left behind. And when I slid that certified envelope across the post office counter, I wasn't shaking with rage. I was simply delivering a consequence. The letter laid everything out. A formal notice of unauthorized sale of personal property. A demand for restitution. Not emotional, not dramatic, just precise. It didn't accuse them of being bad parents. It didn't bring up old wounds. It just presented the facts. The car was mine. They sold it without permission. They forged my signature, and they accepted a payment that wasn't theirs to receive. At the end of the letter, there was a simple request. Repay the full market value of the vehicle, $85,000, within 10 business days, or face legal action. Nothing more, nothing less. I didn't tell anyone else about the letter, not even James. I needed to do this part alone. Not because I didn't trust him. I did. But because there was a part of me that needed to reclaim something quietly, without help, without noise, without anyone standing beside me. When the receipt confirmation arrived 2 days later, my breath caught, not out of fear, but out of finality. They had received it. They had read it. Now they would have to face it. What I didn't expect was the silence that followed. No phone calls, no emails, not even a text. For 3 days, nothing. I imagined them reading the letter over dinner, jaws clenched, accusing each other. I imagined my mother pacing, trying to rewrite the narrative in her head, turning theft into a sacrifice, deception into family duty. But I didn't have to imagine long. On the fourth day, the silence broke. I got a voicemail from my father. His voice was forced calm, almost rehearsed. He wanted to discuss things as a family. He hoped I'd be willing to talk it through. The same tone he used when I was a teenager, and he wanted to smooth over something uncomfortable, like the time he forgot my birthday and gave me a check 3 days late as if that made it fine. I didn't respond. The next day, my mother tried. She called twice, then texted me something that nearly made me laugh. "This isn't like you. You're better than this." Better than what? Better than defending myself? That's when I realized they hadn't understood anything. Not the car, not the betrayal, not the weight of what they'd done. In their eyes, I was still the daughter who stayed quiet, who endured, who understood context. They thought I'd cool down, that I'd remember family comes first, that I'd let it go. Again. But I wasn't the same person who left that car in their garage 3 weeks ago. On the 7th day, I received an email. No subject line, just an attachment. It was a typed letter, unsigned, likely written together, full of vague language and passive phrasing. They regretted the situation. They believed I would have supported the decision if fully informed. They never intended harm, and they hoped this could be resolved in a way that honored our relationship as a family. No plan, no admission of fault, no money. It was insulting. They had committed theft. They had forged my name. They had sold a piece of my life and used it to buy temporary happiness for someone else. And now, they were asking for understanding? I forwarded the email to my attorney. She replied within the hour, attaching our response. Clear, direct, and final. Restitution remained at $85,000. The deadline stood. There would be no further negotiation. If payment wasn't received by close of business on the 10th day, we would file. I reread both letters that night, theirs and ours, one full of avoidance, one full of clarity. And in the contrast between them, I saw the chasm that had opened between who I had been raised to be and who I had become. They wanted their version of me back, the one who apologized for making things awkward, the one who fixed the cracks in the walls they kept punching holes in. But she was gone. On the 9th day, they showed up at my apartment. I didn't let them in. I stood at the window and watched them on the sidewalk. My mother paced, checking her phone. My father stood still, staring at the building. They looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, just diminished somehow. Deflated. When they finally left, I didn't feel victorious. I felt free. Because they knew now. Not just that I was serious, but that I had changed. And for the first time in my life, they would have to meet me where I stood, or face what came next. The letter was a fuse. The silence had been smoke. And now, the fire had arrived. 2 days after the deadline passed, I filed. The court documents were served at 8:43 a.m. on a Tuesday. I know because my lawyer texted me the timestamp. The server said my father answered the door, bleary-eyed and wearing slippers, still holding a coffee mug. My mother appeared behind him, still in her robe. They didn't yell. They didn't cry. They just took the envelope and shut the door. And just like that, the performance ended. There would be no more speeches about family. No more pleas for understanding. Just the truth, laid bare in black ink and legal terms. Within 48 hours, the news spread. I didn't post anything. I didn't tell anyone. But families are ecosystems, even the most broken ones. And when someone moves against the current, it sends ripples in every direction. My aunt called me first, the one who always sided with my mother, always brushed off my concerns as overreactions. She left a voicemail full of clipped disappointment, the kind that says more about expectations than morals. I deleted it without listening to the end. By the weekend, I was getting texts from cousins I hadn't spoken to in years. Some were curious, some were supportive. A few were horrified, not by what I had done, but by what had been done to me. It was surreal, watching people react to something I had lived with quietly for weeks, for years, really. They were catching up in real time to the pain I had already processed, the line I had already crossed. And as word spread, something unexpected began to happen. People started asking questions, not to me, to my parents. They wanted to know why they'd sold a car they didn't own, why they had taken something so clearly personal, so clearly earned, and treated it like a pawn ticket. Why they had done it to me, of all people. The one who had always played by the rules, who had never asked for anything. They had no good answers, because there weren't any. The shine of their justifications began to fade. The story they had told themselves, about sacrifice, about helping Heather, about doing what was best for the family, didn't hold up under scrutiny. They had believed so deeply that no one would question them, that the illusion of unity would be enough to protect them, that I would stay quiet. But I didn't. And now, everything they built on that assumption was starting to crumble. I learned from a friend of my mother's that their church had pulled back on their involvement in an upcoming fundraiser. Too much noise, the organizer had said. Too many questions. One of my father's golf buddies stopped inviting him to weekend rounds. People who used to adore them were suddenly distant. Not because they were being punished, but because the mask had slipped. And now, no one knew quite how to look at them. Meanwhile, Heather stayed silent. Not a word, not a text, not even a comment online. She had returned from her cruise as if nothing had happened, and now she was buried under the weight of what it had cost. I imagined the pressure growing around her like a slow suffocation, not because of guilt, but because the spotlight had finally turned, and it wasn't flattering. She had lived a life of applause, but this time, the crowd had gone quiet. As for me, I kept going. I went to work. I met deadlines. I walked through the world a little taller, not because I felt victorious, but because I was no longer hiding. The burden of being the accommodating daughter had finally lifted, and what was left in its place was space. Space to exist without shrinking. But freedom has its own cost. There were moments where the silence hurt. Moments when I remembered the sound of my mother's laugh before things changed. The way my dad used to pat my shoulder in the kitchen while the coffee brewed. The small gestures that once felt like love, even if they came with conditions. Now, those memories sat in my chest like artifacts from another life. Real, but unreachable. I had no illusions that this process would bring healing. This wasn't about fixing what had been broken. It was about refusing to let the fracture define me. The court date was set. The wheels of consequence were in motion. And still, they hadn't apologized. Not once. Not in writing. Not in whispers. Not through a third party. Not even in passing. Because for people like them, admitting fault was a greater threat than legal action. Losing face meant more than losing trust, but I wasn't after revenge. I didn't want them ruined. I just wanted the truth to live in the light. And now, it did. In the weeks that followed the court filing, I began to feel something I hadn't experienced in years. Stillness. Not silence, not numbness. Stillness. That quiet, anchored kind of peace that settles into your chest after you stop trying to earn permission to be angry. After you stop trying to make someone else understand pain they caused and never acknowledged. I wasn't healed. Not yet. But I had stepped out of the cycle, the one where I excused things in the name of family, where I rationalized disrespect as misunderstanding, where I held myself responsible for everyone else's comfort but my own. That cycle was broken now, and I was finally free to figure out who I was without their version of me clouding the mirror. I spent more time alone, not in a sad or isolating way, in an intentional one. I started waking up early again, like I used to in college, when discipline was survival. But this time, it wasn't out of desperation. It was devotion. To myself. To my sanity. Morning walks turned into morning jogs. Jogging turned into running. Running turned into breath I hadn't felt in my lungs in years. Each mile I put behind me felt like shedding skin. The skin of the obedient daughter, the peacemaker, the one who always stayed quiet. I wasn't that girl anymore. I didn't want to be. At work, something shifted too. I wasn't just showing up. I was leading. With sharper focus, clearer boundaries, more conviction. I started speaking up in meetings with more force, not louder, just more certain. I stopped second-guessing my instincts. I stopped over-explaining. I said what I meant and let it land. Colleagues noticed. My boss noticed. Promotions that had once felt distant started creeping closer. I wasn't surprised. For the first time in my life, I wasn't draining all my energy trying to survive my family dynamic. I was investing it in my own momentum. But it wasn't all fire and progress. There were hard days too. There were moments when I'd catch myself wondering what my mother would think of something I accomplished, before remembering she hadn't even asked how I was since the letter arrived. There were nights I dreamed of my father's voice, gentle and proud, only to wake up to silence. Grief comes in strange forms. You don't just grieve what happened. You grieve what could have been, what should have been. You grieve the love you needed and never got, the apologies that never came, the belief that maybe, just maybe, they'd come around, and the clarity when you realize they won't. But I didn't let those moments pull me back. Instead, I started building forward. One afternoon, I pulled my Corvette out of storage, the real one, the one they hadn't managed to touch. James had kept it safe, untouched, preserved like a treasure. When I saw it again, covered in a fine layer of dust but otherwise perfect, I felt something I hadn't let myself feel since the day I got home from Tokyo. Pride. Not just in the car, in what it represented, in who I had become to afford it, protect it, earn it. I spent the whole day detailing it, alone, in silence, cleaning every inch, running my hands across the smooth red curves, polishing the chrome, vacuuming the carpets. The scent of old leather and fresh wax filled the garage. It was more than maintenance. It was ritual. A reclamation. That night, I drove down Lakeshore Drive, windows down, wind in my face. For the first time in a long while, I let myself feel joy without guilt. I didn't think about who wasn't there. I didn't think about who didn't approve. I just drove. And as the lights of the city blurred around me, I felt it. Not forgiveness, exactly, but release. I wasn't carrying them anymore. They would have to carry themselves. James remained steady through it all. Patient, present, never pushing. He didn't try to fix it. He didn't try to speak for me. He just stood beside me and let me rage, let me rest, let me process. His support was the kind that didn't ask for anything in return, and slowly, I started to let him back in, not just to the story, but to the quieter places of my mind I'd been guarding for years. We started planning small trips again, just the two of us. Nothing extravagant, weekend drives, little diners, antique shows. He'd always known how to make the ordinary feel sacred. And after months of pain and distance, sacred was what I needed most. The lawsuit was still in motion. My parents had retained an attorney, finally realizing I wasn't bluffing. Depositions were coming. Documents were being collected. There were motions, hearings, mediation dates on the calendar. But by that point, the outcome didn't define me anymore. I didn't need them to lose. I just needed them to see, for once, that they couldn't keep taking and expect the world to bend in their favor. The process was slow. Legal systems always are. But I didn't feel impatient, because the longer it took, the stronger I became. Every day that passed without their approval made me realize I had never truly needed it. And every time I chose myself, again and again, I stitched back a piece of the woman they tried to silence, not to spite them, but to honor me. The case never went to trial. A month before the court date, their lawyer contacted mine with a settlement proposal: full restitution, quiet resolution. No media, no further contact. A clean end to a dirty decision. I accepted. Not because it erased what happened. It didn't. But because I didn't need to see them punished anymore. I didn't need them humiliated or dragged through the legal system. I had already won in ways they would never fully understand. The money returned to my account felt symbolic more than anything. A number on a screen that represented so much more than value. It represented closure. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but confirmation. That I had been right to stand up. That I hadn't imagined the injustice. That protecting what I loved wasn't selfish. I used some of the settlement to install a state-of-the-art security system for my building. I made donations to a women's mentorship program I once benefited from. I opened a savings account for a future restoration project, maybe a Mustang or something completely different. Not because I needed it, but because I wanted the choice to build something again. Choice. That was what all of this had been about, at its core. The right to choose what is mine, to choose who I trust, to choose my boundaries and know they will be honored. I didn't speak to my parents again after the settlement. I didn't write a message. I didn't wait for one either. I knew they were ashamed, even if they never said it. I knew my mother had told a few carefully edited versions of the story to save face. I didn't care. What I cared about was that I no longer lived in the story they had written for me. And for the first time, neither did Heather. She reached out once. Just one message. Long, stiff, and strangely apologetic in a way that felt rehearsed. She didn't defend herself. She didn't beg. She simply said she hadn't realized what the car meant, that she didn't know how deep the cut had gone, that she hoped someday we could speak. I didn't reply. Maybe one day I will. But I needed more time. Not because I hated her, I don't, but because some distances are necessary. Some fractures aren't ready to be healed, and I wasn't going to rush the repair just to soothe someone else's discomfort. I had done that enough. Instead, I turned toward the life I was creating, the one built on my terms, the one I no longer had to explain or justify. James and I moved into a new apartment. Nothing fancy, just something fresh, a little closer to the lake, a little further from the echoes of the past. On weekends, we'd take long drives, sometimes in silence, sometimes singing to old songs, always with the wind in our hair and a quiet between us that felt like trust. The Corvette became more than a car again. It became a ritual, a reminder, a symbol of how far I had come and how far I was still going. I kept it pristine, not out of fear, but out of reverence, because it wasn't just metal and leather. It was memory. It was power. It was proof. One afternoon, I drove it out to my grandfather's old property, now overgrown and quiet. I parked on the edge of what used to be his workshop, walked into the field, and stood there for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't talk out loud. I just stood in the space where it all began, where he taught me to listen to the heartbeat of a machine and reminded me, without ever needing to say it, that I mattered. I hoped he would have been proud. Not because of what I had accomplished, but because I had defended what he gave me: dignity, direction, grit. It's easy to love someone when they're easy to love, when they agree, comply, smile, nod. It's harder to love them when they draw lines, when they say, no more, when they become someone who won't be bent for the sake of comfort. But that's who I am now, and I'm not bending. To everyone who's ever had their boundaries crossed in the name of love, to anyone who's ever been told to just understand while being overlooked or used, I see you, I've been you, and I can tell you with everything in me, standing your ground isn't cruel, it's courageous. If this story resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe to support this channel, and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Leave a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I read every single one. And I mean it when I say this. May your day be calm, your heart protected, and your voice never silenced again. Because you're allowed to say, this is mine. And you don't owe anyone your silence to prove it.